Hey, this is Suzanne, and we want to thank Thrive Academics Assessments for sponsoring Not by the Book. Unlock your students' potential with Thrive Academics Assessments. For just $25, gain unlimited access to their comprehensive online assessments for Math K-12 and Reading K-11 throughout the entire school year. Thrive Assessments are developed by Scantron Corporation and have administered over 170 million tests. They're norm referenced. You can compare your child's performance to national standards, Florida State approved assessments, computer adaptive, so you can pinpoint your student's exact skill level, online and flexible. There are no time limits, no proctor needed, and you can take tests anytime 24/7. Affordable and comprehensive. One low price of $25 for both subjects. Easy to read reports that help identify your child's strengths and weaknesses. Step Up for Students scholarships mandate an annual assessment. Thrive Academics is the best and most affordable solution. You can purchase directly from Thrive or the My Scholar Shop. Ready to see the difference? Visit the My Scholar Shop today and purchase your Thrive assessments. For more details, visit www.assessk12.com.
All these things that I had been, I had committed a lot of obviously energy and time and money into heading toward going to med school. But yet this thing that I really loved, writing and performing and entertaining, I felt like, wow, this is just, it feels like such a passion for me. And so I just talked to people who knew me, and it's just, I just sought counsel and what I kept hearing back from people is like, Mike, we think, you're gifted in this area, maybe you should pursue this.
From the Florida Parent Educators Association, home of the largest homeschool convention in America, this is the Not by the Book podcast. I'm your host, FPEA Chairman Suzanne Nunn, and together we will hear from guests who share their journey to who and where they are today. Each one of them at some point left the expected path, ripped the page out of the book that says you have to do it like this, and made their own way. I hope these conversations inspire you as much as they do me. Today I have a fantastic opportunity to talk with Mike Nawrocki, co-creator of VeggieTales and the voice of Larry the Cucumber. We talk about Mike's interests and passions that led him to his creative journey and the rewards and challenges of pursuing his passion. We also get to talk about his more recent creative adventures with the Dead Sea Squirrels. This one is sure to stir up that inner child. Let's take a listen.
So I grew up in a military house. And so probably a couple things to know is my dad was career Air Force. And we, with a name like Nawrocki, we were a Polish Catholic family. So both of my grandparents from my dad's side immigrated from Poland between the wars. And that was a big part of my upbringing. And so my mom and dad met in Ohio when my dad was first out of officers training school and stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So her part of the family grew up in the Dayton area, and then my dad was there for, his first assignment out of OTS. Yeah, so I was born at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1966.
Fantastic.
And then my dad was immediately reassigned. I think he had been there maybe a couple years before he met my mom, but then he was immediately reassigned to Tokyo right after I was born. And so, in fact, we were just talking, I just got back from visiting Tokyo for the first time, since my 4th birthday. So, so from when I was 6 months old to when I was 4 years old, we lived in Tokyo. He was at Tokyo Air Base. I don't know. There's probably an official name for it, but we were at an air base in Tokyo. And I have a handful of memories from them. One of them is both of my parents worked. My mom was a nurse. My dad, worked obviously in the Air Force. And so during the day, I had a Japanese nanny, Mia-san, and who watched me and spoke with me exclusively in Japanese. And so by the time I was 4, I was bilingual, as a English and Japanese. And then on my 4th birthday, my dad got reassigned to Los Angeles. And so we moved over there and just sort of, did what military families do, just kind of bopping around. I have 3 brothers, an older brother, Bob, who's my half-brother, but grew up with him, all of my childhood. And then Mark and Steve is my next youngest brother, and then Mark. So, with military families, a lot of what you hear is just because there's so much change and disruption and a lot of moving. I became really close to my brothers because we were kind of a pack, that
Right.
move around together. So really close to my brothers, but Southern California for a while, and then Colorado, the Denver area for a few more years. And then my dad was then restationed to the Pentagon, at one point, and right around 76, 77, right around then.
Okay.
And that was a significant moment in my life because, we were, like I said, Polish Catholic. We were sort of cultural Catholic. We went to church, but there really wasn't any real connection in my faith that I can remember, and real personal relationship with Jesus. And so my dad got restationed to the Pentagon. We couldn't sell our house in Colorado at the time. And so he moved to DC and was actually living with his commanding officer while we were trying to sell our house. Well, we found out later, that his CO was a strong believer. And by the time we sold our house and joined our dad in Northern Virginia, at our new house there, we had a completely different dad.
Wow.
He
That's
was
amazing.
it was so cool because, he was a good dad, but he was very, as you imagine a military dad would be, very, strict and, stern and all those things.
Right.
But we just saw a softness in him when we met, and that just really impacted the whole family, and in the course of the next year, we all came to the Lord, in various ways. For me, it was, sitting with my dad in our house watching a Billy Graham crusade on TV. Dr. Graham was talking
and you're saying
about,
that was 1976?
yeah, that would have been, that would have
around
been
that
about
time.
77, 78 by about this time, I think. Yeah.
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 It's funny that you say that because my childhood at that point, it seems like we were always watching Billy Graham crusades. They were always on TV. We saw them all the time. So when you say that, that brings up memories because
That brings up memories.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so the groundwork had sort of been laid, and and that was the moment when I came to the Lord. And we sort of shifted over to a new church in our area close that somebody had recommended, and they had a really dynamic youth group program. And so, we just started to get excited about going to church, just like, oh, wow, this is fun. We get to be with our friends and learn all these new great things. And they also had a wonderful, kind of a fledgling, arts ministry that, we did, we would sing and, do little plays and all that kind of thing. And this was in the Northern Virginia area. And then, of course, he was reassigned back to Colorado, which, my dad was not a fan of being at the Pentagon. He just, was, just didn't like the politics of that all.
Yeah.
It's always been a highly political place. And so for him, he, was thrilled to be able to come back to Colorado, which was the favorite place, for him that we had lived in all of his stations, to eventually retire there. And so we went back to Colorado again. We're in a similar church. The Christian and Missionary Alliance is the denomination that we were with. Yeah, so just continued to, kind of go through high school. I fell in love at that point with performing, with singing.
Okay.
We kind of had a musical family. My mom, she was a musician. Both of her parents were professional musicians in the, kind of on the East Coast when she was growing up. Although she grew up, they had a lot of problems in her family with, alcoholism and everything. And so she was basically an orphan, with two parents who, were performers but drank their wages away, and
wow.
she sort of kind of left her and her siblings into the foster system. But she was very musical. My older brother Bob was great. I mean, he's to this day just a fantastic guitar player, and so I had that sort of in me, and I loved it. I didn't see that as a possibility for me vocationally growing up. I had no idea that people do this for a living, and some people even do it for a ministry. I just didn't know that. For me, it was just fun, and
it was fun.
Yeah, so I just loved writing. I loved performing. Whenever there was a play at church, I would be in it, or a choir. I just loved that. And then I started to get involved a little bit more in children's church, and
Okay.
helping out there. And they had a program. It was kind of a Sesame Street knockoff at the time. It was called Caraway Street.
Yeah.
It's so super creative there, right? And so, but it was similar thing where they built a set inside the children's church, and there would be puppets and live action, and I got into that, loved it in high school. But I went forward at a youth convention held by the CMA in my junior year in high school.
Okay.
And I went forward and dedicated my vocation to ministry. And for me, it was like, I felt like God was calling me to do something for him, but I didn't really know what that was. I didn't feel like I was being called to become a pastor.
Right.
I didn't enjoy public speaking very much, and it wasn't something I was like, oh yeah, I'd be good at that. But
So you weren't
and
really
so-
sure what that looked like in your head. You just knew that your heart was there. Yeah.
I knew my heart was there. And so, so I did my best to look around to figure out what that was, and so, my dad was an engineer. My mom was a nurse. At that time, when I was in high school, my older brother was a chemistry major in college. And so I sort of put all of those pieces together in my 17-year-old brain and decided that, God wanted me to be a missionary doctor because,
Okay.
and the denomination that we were in was, heavily invested in missions as well. We had missionaries coming through church all the time. And so that's what, I figured I was being called to. And, so I finished up high school. The CMA had a number of colleges, sprinkled throughout the country, denominational colleges. And the closest one to me in Denver was the one in Minnesota. It was called St. Paul Bible College. It started off in St. Paul, Minnesota, then kind of moved out to the western suburbs of Minneapolis. It's called Crown College today.
Okay.
So, I thought, okay, well, what I want to do is I want to go to that college, my denomination's college. They didn't have a pre-med program, but I thought, well, I'll just go there for a year or two, get some Bible classes out of the way, kind of get that ready, and then transfer to a place where I could do pre-med.
Okay.
And then I went, off and away. And I can pause there if you want to talk about little kid Michael a little bit more, but I can tell you about college Michael in a minute.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that one of my curious questions would be, you were interested in music and the arts is fun.
Yeah.
What other things through those years before you were 17, did you
Yeah.
have anything that you were super interested in or thought this is what I want to do? Or were you just
Yeah.
kind of enjoying all of the arts in your free time and being a kid?
The other thing I recall just being super curious. And for me, the sciences were fun. I mentioned my brother was a chemistry major. I love kind of following along with him. I had a subscription. I was the only one I knew among my friends who had a subscription to Scientific American, if you can remember that magazine.
I do.
So
Yep.
I was just curious. And so the idea of being in the sciences, actually excited me too. It wasn't anything that I thought, oh, okay, well, that's just boring stuff. I just want to be in entertainment. I enjoyed both. And so, so that was, I recall that. I was also involved in sports. I was a swimmer was probably my biggest sport. So I swam competitively in high school and kind of AAU, which was like the amateur athletic union. Did that, played tennis. I wanted to play football, but my mom being a nurse
was like,
would
no.
not let her boys play football.
I understand. Totally understand that. Curiosity is a strong driving force in being a creative too. I think that it definitely probably has worked its way out in a lot of ways in your life. But yeah, so college, you go to school to do some basic Bible education before going to become a doctor.
Yes.
That got interfered with there somewhere along the way, right?
It did. Well, so every student at St. Paul Bible College was required to do a student ministry of some sort, and so I kind of looked at the list, and one of the things stuck out to me as I was looking through is there was a puppet ministry. And it's like, oh, wait a minute, I've done puppets before. That'll be kind of fun. And to me, another thing on the list was street witnessing, which was terrifying. It was terrifying to me. It's like, no, I want to hide behind puppets. So I signed up for the puppet team, and the first day on the puppet team, another guy that signed up for the puppet team, his name is Phil Vischer. Phil,
this
of
is
course,
where the
would
great
later.
minds meet.
That's right, on the puppet team. Yeah, it's where great minds meet and where you go to meet girls.
Oh, there you go.
Which is absolutely not true. It's like nothing could be nerdier than being on the puppet team.
It didn't work.
So Phil and I met doing puppets, and we just had a great creative collaboration. We would write our own material and perform. We had very similar influences comedically. I was really into, growing up into the Dr. Demento radio hour. I don't know if that rings any bells for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would not miss it. Every Sunday night, it was parody music. And I think I like parody music more than like regular, top 40 music.
Yeah,
so I never missed
funny.
it. Weird Al Yankovic got to start
yeah.
there. So I love that. I loved Monty Python. I loved Mel Brooks movies. That was sort of my jam. And Phil was very similar. And so we had just this sense of humor that really complemented each other. And so we would write these shows, and we'd like to say we traveled around the Minnesota countryside scaring the Baptists with our puppets. So we did that, and we both had a similar path, though. I mean, I was only planning on being there for a year or two. He wanted to go to film school, and they didn't have a film program, so he wanted to only go there for a year or two. And so we both found ourselves after a year and a half, moving on and making plans to be roommates in California. Him to go to film school, me to go to pre-med. But yeah, those plans were also interrupted. After the first semester of our sophomore year, I moved back to Colorado, where I was from. He moved back to Chicago, where he was from. And so we were working, and I took a couple of classes. I took an anatomy class and an anatomy and physiology and maybe a trigonometry class or something like that. And he got an internship at a video post-production house. And by the end of that semester, they offered him a job. And so all of a sudden, he's like, well, this is kind of what I want to do. So he called me and he said, hey, Mike, I don't think I'm going to take a pause on, going back to college and work this job. And so I'm roommateless all of a sudden. So I figure, and by this time too, my parents actually were going through a rough spot in their marriage, and their marriage was kind of falling apart, and they ended up in divorce. But I was, back at home in Colorado after, 3 semesters away at college, living in my parents' basement as they were going through this horrible time and this divorce. Right. And so, I felt like, oh, well, I just need to get out of here. And I knew that there was just as many places in, Chicago for pre-med as there were in California. And so, I packed up everything and in my little red Ford Fiesta,
I love it.
and drove out to Chicago to, kind of start there. And so I began working part-time to establish residency in Illinois. Of course, with my parents going through a divorce, their finances were in a shambles, and I had, 2 younger brothers who were also starting school, so my parents couldn't afford college, for us.
For everyone,
and so I started working to get residency and, as a Illinois resident. And then I ended up, after a year, enrolling in the University of Illinois, Chicago, which is a state school there of the U of I network, and in pre-med. But along the way there, so I'm working odd jobs, but then a job opens up at the post house that Phil is working at as a graveyard shift VHS tape duplicator. And so,
that is a great job.
Yeah, great job. So working the 11 to 7 shift, duplicating 2-hour videotapes. And while the videotapes were rolling, I was able to, I was kind of like I mentioned, I was really curious. And that was the whole time when I was in high school, it was sort of the computer, beginning of the computer revolution too.
Right.
And I was really fascinated in computers. And so, I also, I had run sound for my brother's band because he was a musician. So, so I had some technical, kind of inclinations. And so I was able to figure out, this, the equipment and start going out on shoots on weekends and during the days with the company, and just kind of learning this new emerging technology, because nonlinear editing was just kind of coming into being. A lot of computer graphics were just in their infancy, and so these were things that we were kind of right on the cusp of. And so and then I'm going through college. I'm doing my pre-med, and I'm a biology major, and then I also fell in love with history, so I picked up history as a second major. And we were, my plan was, okay, so once I graduate, I'm going to go to, and this is what I did. I applied with the Peace Corps once I graduated, and then, I wanted to go teach biology in Africa for a couple of years and then come back and go to medical school. Okay. And so that was my plan. And, so working, going through, going to school, and we came up with the idea of, what would become VeggieTales during that time. We thought, well, if we could use this newly emerging art form of computer animation with really simple characters, with no limbs, no hair, no clothes, to be able to tell stories, the kind of stories we told when we were traveling around with our puppets, we felt like that could be a really needed thing. We just felt like, just kind of looking at the culture as well, having grown up in the church and seeing what was available for kids at the time. It was sort of the advent of MTV, a lot of the stuff on, Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon that was coming out that wasn't necessarily great for kids.
Right.
And we felt, sort of, on one end there was Mr. Rogers, that was really earnest and really wholesome, and we loved that. But, on the other end, there was, Ren and Stimpy, that was really edgy and funny. It's like maybe there could be something kind of in between, that held a biblical worldview that, and for me, that was the missional part of it. It's like there's a God who made us, who loves us, who wants a relationship with us. What if we could tell stories with kids, really entertaining stories for kids with that worldview assumption. And so, so I felt like, this is great. I'll do it. This is fun, and then eventually I'll, move on to what God really wants me to do.
Yeah.
And,
but you said though, that now you were still moving forward with your degree, and you did go into the Peace Corps.
So this is the interesting thing. So I graduated, college, my undergrad. I applied for the Peace Corps. Working, we had done a little demo for VeggieTales. Phil had taken that out to start to try to raise money, to do a first episode. Well, I received an acceptance letter for Peace Corps the same month that Phil secured funding for our very first episode of Where's God When I'm Scared. And so it was like a huge kind of decision point in my life, because, all these things that I had been, I had committed a lot of obviously energy and time and money into heading toward, going to med school. But yet this thing that I really loved, writing and performing and, just entertaining, I felt like, wow, this is just, it feels like such a passion for me. And so I just talked to people who knew me, and it's just, I just sought counsel and, what I kept hearing back from people is like, Mike, we think, you're gifted in this area, maybe you should pursue this. So I turned down Peace Corps, and we went to work on what would become known as Where's God When I'm Scared. We hadn't, and with VeggieTales. And so we finished that in the just before Christmas in 1993, and shipped off 500 or so VHS copies that parents had ordered through ads that we had placed in Christian parenting magazines.
So you were making those decisions before all of the now this is a classic, just a placeholder in our lives of where we taught our kids about things and how we introduced, sometimes very hard topics to our children in a way that was easy to digest, and so many things. But you were on the front end of that thinking, is this really going to work? and making a decision, a life-altering decision for, what is this trajectory now going to look like? So, but it was exciting. So I know that was 1993, and Where's God When I'm Scared was something, that to me, I was already a mom. I had a very young child at that point. So I was a young mom, but I had a young child, and I can remember, being first introduced to VeggieTales, and that one really actually touched our lives because my daughter went through some very challenging things as a young child. And that was a video that we watched,
Wow.
and it had an impact on her life and on our lives. And so I was kind of sold at that point. Like, you didn't have to do a whole lot more for me. That was it. But
Oh, love it.
it started, I'm sure it moved pretty quickly
Yeah.
for you all from that point, because you sold your first 500 that you sent out. How quickly did that build and just blow up for you guys?
Yeah, it was a slow build. We spent about $60,000 to make our first episode.
Mm-hmm.
We charged $15 a tape for our very first VHS and sold 500 episodes. So if you do the math, it doesn't add up to $60,000. So it's very falls far short of that. But it was still a very inexpensive production. So we took out these ads in Christian parenting magazines, but the ad caught the eye of an executive so we were up in Chicago doing this, but Word Records, based out of Nashville, was just launching a new children's label called Everlyn Entertainment. And one of the executives there had seen our ad and ordered a copy and loved it, just loved the tape. And so he called us up, and, we started those conversations, and, within a couple months, we had a distribution deal through Word, licensing deal, where they would basically give us advances on future royalties, kind of like the book world works. Advances on future royalties, so we could do our production, and then they would go out. So Word would do that. They were very modest advances, and so for us it was still a big financial struggle to kind of make ends meet. There were just a few of us. There was Phil and I. We had hired 2 kids out of art school to help animate. Kurt Heineke hadn't come on full time yet. Kurt was the music director at the church that we were going to, who would eventually come on full time as our director of music. But all of the VeggieTales songs, all the score, I co-wrote all my silly songs with Kurt, all that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and then Phil's wife Lisa was Junior Asparagus, and so the voice of Junior Asparagus. Yeah, so she was kind of on board in that early crew as well. So we had, it was a small group, but, as we started to, make more episodes and, they grew in popularity, we would hire more people to be able to create episodes faster, but it was still a number of years. I mean, I was still working, I was working full time at Big Idea, but then I was also, freelancing to be able to pay my bills, because we couldn't, pay everybody, every month with just on what we were making. But we found out that, a few years in, that and they had started to become really popular in Christian bookstores, because a lot of, I think, word of mouth, and particularly with a lot of the bookstore owners who were kind of, or not owners but workers who were kind of college age kids, just sort of resonated with the humor of the shows. And so they'd have little corners set up, where they would just kind of run VeggieTales episodes on repeat. Yeah. And then, so parents would see that and they would get, good word of mouth. And so the word started to spread, and they started to become really popular in Christian bookstores. We were then approached by, some of the major retailers, like, Walmart and Target and everything. And they said, "Well, we love these. We love the popularity. We think these could be great in the general market if you just, remove the God language, dial that back a little bit." And we weren't interested in that, because that was the heart of VeggieTales. It was the reason VeggieTales existed. Right. And so we turned that down. But eventually, you remember Barney the dinosaur?
Yes, I do.
So Dick Leach, who was a strong Catholic believer, actually, was the head of Barney, and he was a VeggieTales fan. And Barney had a distribution network throughout, all of the big mass retailers. And he said, "Hey, look, I would love for you guys to keep VeggieTales exactly like it is, and we're gonna take it out through Lyric Studios, which was the name of his organization, into our distribution network." And so when that happened, that's when VeggieTales really exploded. That was around 97, 98 when it really started to.
So a few years there, some strong commitment to that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I think that it's funny that you mentioned that, and you mentioned the Christian bookstores, because they were everywhere. That was one of the favorite places for us to go on a Saturday, was the Christian bookstore. And I am a collector of nativities. Okay.
Oh, nice.
And so it was funny that the first nativity that I purchased for my child was the VeggieTales nativity. And
Oh, I love that. I've got one of those. Yeah, we put it
I'm
out
sure.
every year. Yeah.
And we loved that VeggieTales nativity, and all of the little star that sang and everything was
Yeah.
amazing. It was just amazing.
Oh,
So, near and dear to our hearts.
yeah.
And obviously it was something that was needed and resonated with families, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
who wanted the wholesome, and it didn't scare people that there was a faith base to this
Yeah, absolutely.
at
Yeah,
all.
because I think from a storytelling perspective, what we always try to do is make sure that the lesson was integrated with the story. It wasn't like tacked on. It wasn't, you weren't being preached, but you were making, dramatic argument about your point. It's
Yeah.
like, this is, you don't have to be afraid because God is bigger than the boogeyman,
Yeah.
and so you show a character, kind of, going through their change, with that theme, and I think it's kind of part of great storytelling is just to not, you're making a dramatic argument, and how do you prove that dramatic argument? You do it through, real emotions, whether it's comedy or whatever, but that's, you're connecting with an audience emotionally, and those values are coming through in a really honest way. And so that's what we really tried to do. And, and in that sense, the values that we were talking about, those core biblical values, rang true for people,
Yeah.
and whether they were Christians or not a lot of times. And so, which I think is it's the real power of story, and I think why it's so important that Christians be involved in the media, be involved in storytelling, and in a way that is telling good stories that are well told stories that really do the message that we're talking about, justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to know that really kind of on the front end of the changes, like you said, because in the 80s, you have a lot of changes coming with computer technology and everything that, we were growing through and learning through. And it was refreshing as a Christian, a young Christian mom at that point. It was refreshing to see that space that could so easily have just been completely given over to non-faith-based the secular world,
Yeah.
had people who were creative and who were doing that really well. Not just, because we all saw a lot of things that weren't done really well during those
Yeah.
during those years.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
that you all had something that you created that was strong and that survived that, comparison that was going to be happening as all of those things developed more and technology developed more, and it just, you grew with that. And I think that that's encouraging. But, you grew in other ways here because you were also the voice of one of these characters
Yep.
that
that's
we
right.
all know and love. Larry the Cucumber. Can tell us a little bit about putting a voice to Larry and how that came about.
Yeah, so Larry's voice for our very first show. So Phil and I, we had done puppetry and everything, and so we launched VeggieTales, and on a very short, or a very meager budget as well. We were like, it's going to be a lot cheaper to just do the voices ourselves, than hire professional actors. And we did have some professional actors that came in to help us out. The church that we were involved with was heavily invested in the arts, and so like Scooter the Carrot, was he was a professional actor in Chicago, and and there was a couple others. But Phil and I kind of used some of the voices that we did in puppets, and so Bob was kind of just like like an excited Phil, it's his voice, just kind of a little more up and higher pitched. But the voice that I used for Larry initially was a voice for a puppet called Soupy that I had done, and it was a kind of a lower, dopier voice with a lisp, So if you watch Worth God When I'm Scared, Larry sounds a little more, he kind of sounds like that. And it's funny because I didn't know a whole lot about voice acting and all that, but over the next few episodes, it's like the energy of the voice started to increase as I started to find the character more and kind of figure out where I wanted him to land. And so he got a little squeakier, got a little higher pitched. I kept the lisp for a few more shows. I think I lost the lisp, maybe around show 8 or 9, something like that.
Okay, yeah.
But so I like to say that Larry went through reverse puberty speech therapy to do all those things.
That's
So,
fantastic.
but yeah, so I ended up with the Larry voice, the Larry voice that I ended up with, it just became, a really comfortable place for me to be able to, kind of inhabit the character in a way that I felt like was real. And, and we, with Bob and Larry, their relationship as characters kind of mirrored the relationship that Phil and I had with friends. And so it was really easy for, us to kind of figure out where kind of our lanes were, with those,
Right.
Phil was kind of a little bit more of the, the visionary and a little bit more serious, and okay, we're on a mission from God. We got to do this. And, while Larry was always, more distractible and more silly and, can kind of go off on tangents. And so that was definitely more like me.
That's fantastic. I love that. So you went into beyond the episodes, you all created some movies. And so you were doing the voice, you were doing the creative work, but you also started doing some directing and screenwriting for these larger projects.
Yeah.
How was that transitioning from your episodes into movies that you were creating?
Right. Yeah. That was interesting because, we had written sketches, basically with sketch comedy that we did with VeggieTales. There were short stories.
Yeah.
But as we started to get a little bit more ambitious with telling longer stories, particularly me, I knew that I needed more tools to be able to do that. And so, so I enrolled, I had had writing classes, I was a history major, so I had writing classes, but I had never had a screenwriting class, up through the first few years of VeggieTales. And so I enrolled in a screenwriting course at the University of Chicago. And, I had read a book that I thought was really fascinating to me in college as part of my history major, Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. And I just remember reading it at the time. Yeah, exactly. I just remember reading that book and just thinking, wow, because the main character reminded me in a lot of ways of my own mother. And I just remember wanting a happier ending for that. I was always very, optimistic, very happy. And, having a tragic ending for a novel to me was very, was very sad. And so I had imagined, so going into the screenwriting class, I thought, okay, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to, and of course bad puns were always been my forte too. So Madame Blueberry. So I'm going to write this story of Madame Blueberry, in this screenwriting class.
Fantastic.
And but just learning more about, screenwriting format, kind of the architecture of story, and that really helped me to kind of formulate that story during that class. So I wrote that during that class, and then, had this script that I came out, and that was Madame Blueberry, obviously. And that was the first full episode that I directed. Before that point, I was, writing and directing the silly songs, but Madame Blueberry was the first full episode that I directed. And so, so I continued to study story structure and screenwriting, and we felt like, okay, our stories can get a little bit more robust because we kind of know a little bit more about the architecture that, these needs to support longer stories. And so, we started getting into more, the Larry Boys were a little bit more bigger and more cinematic.
Yeah.
I then wrote Esther, which was kind of more of a cinematic, longer story as well. And then we had always, we with the company, we wanted to have impact on the culture. Our mission statement for Big Idea was to markedly enhance the spiritual and moral fabric of society through creative media. It's kind of a fancy mission statement, but we wanted to have that kind of cultural impact, and we always felt like movies did that. Because movies would just had made a big splash and got a lot of attention, and so we felt like doing a movie, we were kind of working toward being able to do that. And I remember I was working on a screenplay for what then was the home video project of Jonah, the story of Jonah.
Okay.
And I was writing it, and it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And I went to Phil, and we were talking about it, and we decided, okay, well, maybe this should be our first movie. And so he dove in on it as well, and we co-wrote the film, and then that became our first feature film, Jonah, a VeggieTales movie. And it had its pluses and minuses. I think it turned out wonderful. We got really great reception from it, but it put the company under a lot of stress because it cost a lot of money to to make a feature film, and while we were making the feature film, we had to dial back on our home video output just because we didn't have the bandwidth to create both, and so that slowed down our revenue stream. And so by the time the movie came out, we needed it to do X amount, and it didn't reach that amount. And so, we had some other things going on in the company as well. And we, ended up going through a bankruptcy reorganization and after the movie. And so we basically lost control of the company at that point, and they went into bankruptcy. So.
And what year was Jonah?
Jonah was 2002, I believe.
Okay. So it was I was going to say it was about 10 years. Close to 10 years later.
10 years or so. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So after Jonah and after the reorganization of the company, how did you all move forward then with your creative ideas and, what was your passion?
And so that was it was a tough time for me because, obviously we lost the company. I nearly, my wife and I we were a young family. We nearly lost our house and all of that. And so, but another company stepped in to buy us out of bankruptcy, a company out of New York called Classic Media. And essentially, they reorganized us in a way where, we had a big animation studio up in Chicago at this time with over 200 people. And it just became untenable to, have that big of an organization. And so they reorganized us down to about 40 people, where we would just do the pre-production, like the stories. We'd write the stories, do the music, eventually do all the post-production as well. But that animation piece, we would start to work with other animation companies, with that.
Okay.
And by this time, at the very beginning, we were the only ones VeggieTales was the very first computer animated series on TV. We were like before Toy Story, so nobody was really doing computer animation. But 10 or plus years in, a lot of these other, animation specific companies were starting that all did service work, and so we started working with a company out of Toronto to do our animation at that point. So I was offered a salary position, as an employee with the new company, and so I decided to take that. And then I moved with the new company down to Nashville, which was where we relocated down in Franklin. Phil elected to remain an independent contractor where he would still do writing and voices, but stay in Chicago and in the Chicago area. So I moved down here with my family along with some other, folks that were involved in Big Idea. And we got a new start on, the brand and just continued to make home videos, up through 2016, which is when I left. And during that time, we had another opportunity to do another feature film, The Pirates Who Don't Do Anything.
Who Don't Do Anything, yeah.
Yeah, through Universal. And so that's, but all those years, I felt like, God was able to redeem, that bankruptcy, and we were still able to do to do really good work. It wasn't the same. We had different bosses with different goals. But what they did know was that, we knew our audience, and they were smart enough to say, okay, we don't want to stand in the way of you guys serving your audience.
Right.
But it definitely became more of a sales and marketing oriented endeavor than a, creative endeavor, and so, the thing about show business is you have to have both, for you to be able to continue on, you have to have a smart business plan, but, you also have to, have the good balance of, that creative vision. And so, it was challenging at times for sure, but I think we were able to continue to do some good work.
Oh yeah.
And then, and then 2016, we had, Classic Media was acquired by DreamWorks Animation. And then DreamWorks eventually was acquired by Universal. And by that time, in 2016, what Universal did was they basically folded up the home video units of both us at Big Idea and Classic and DreamWorks Animation, because nobody was buying home video anymore by that time. It was all moving to streaming. And so that's when I left, to figure out what was next in my life.
For you. Yeah. So that was in 2016. Now, you've already settled in Nashville, Franklin area at that point. When did you get connected with, because currently you are the director of film and animation at Lipscomb, correct? Or
Yeah,
professor,
so
I'm sorry, not director,
I'm actually
professor.
I'm just a a regular old professor there, but
Yeah.
so I went in 2016. I went and had coffee with my good friend Steve Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
If you grew up in the 80s
Oh,
listening to
yeah.
Christian music, you'll know exactly who Steve Taylor is.
Yes.
So, but he's also a filmmaker, and so he had started a new film school at Lipscomb, and I went and had coffee with him just to ask what he was up to, because we had worked together on our movies on Jonah and the Pirates. He had
Okay.
written a couple songs for those movies, and we had gotten to be friends. So I went to have coffee just to see what was up with him, and he asked me if I had ever considered teaching, which I kind of had. I mean, my kids at that age were kind of getting near college age, and I kind of had that thing within me. It's like, okay, well, I was getting to the point in my career where it's like, okay, I feel like I have enough to be able to, kind of train the next generation and all that kind of thing. And so I like the idea, but my undergraduate work was not in the arts. I mentioned it was in biology and history. And so he said, well, they had a MFA program there. So he said, why don't you come and you can be an artist in residence and then go through our MFA program and get your terminal degree to teach. And so I did. So I enrolled, in that program and did the MFA. What was happening at that time also is I was starting to pitch around an idea for a series I had in mind for a number of years called the Dead Sea Squirrels.
Okay.
And I was being pitched the idea around, and a good friend of mine, Dan Lynch, who was in publishing, said, hey, have you ever considered this as an early reader series? And I hadn't, but I thought that was a really interesting idea. So I went away and did some research and kind of worked up a pitch as an early reader series. And he set up a meeting with Tyndale Publishers, and they loved the idea. And so I signed a book deal and started writing the books. As I was going through grad school, my MFA program, and I used my MFA, kind of like I did with Madame Blueberry when I took my very first, screenwriting class. I used the MFA program as a way to develop the book series into an animated series. And so, I did adaptations of the first few books into screenplays, and I did like a whole production Bible and, business pitch and plan and all that kind of thing. And so I'm going through my MFA, and I finished the MFA program in 2019. And then got hired on as a full-time professor at that point. So I started teaching full-time in the fall semester of 2019. And then, was continuing to write the books, teach, and then we had the opportunity then to, Steve and I, found some investors that were interested in creating a pilot based off, an animated pilot based off the first book. And so we did that alongside our, utilizing the students from the university. We have a really wonderful film and animation program and theater program as well. So we were casting, some of the roles between, there was professional voiceover actors who were using, but also student voices. There's a song in every episode that the student animators were animating. So we put together a production unit for the students to animate that first song. And the pilot turned out great. And so just as a sort of a proof of concept. And so from there, then we were able to raise the rest of the money to make the full, 13 episode season. And, we set up the whole pipeline there and, again, using students for the songs. And then we set up a partnership with a New Zealand animation studio to do the bulk of the animation. And really the production pipeline that I used was very similar to what we had then done with VeggieTales, after the bankruptcy, where all of the creative, script writing and songwriting and all of that happened, within, out of our base in Nashville. And then we worked with this animation studio in New Zealand, and then came back and we did all the post-production. And so we just wrapped, last year, we just wrapped our 13 episodes. We did a deal with the Wonder Project, who you might recognize that name from House of David, which is out now on Amazon. So we did a licensing deal through Wonder Project, and then they have sub-licensed us to Minnow TV, which is a Christian kids streaming service. And so we, the series is now on Minnow. So we're so excited and to have that in the world. So there's 12 books out. There's 13 animated episodes based off those 12 books, and I'm super excited about this next phase,
next season. Well, what is the what year were those published, the books?
I think the first book came out in 2017, if I'm not wrong. 2017, 2018. Yeah.
So we have been exposed to the Dead Sea Squirrels at FPEA because you were able to premiere that at FPEA, which was amazing. I loved that moment.
Goodness. Yes.
Yeah. So that was exciting for everybody who was attending. But tell us a little bit more about what that looks like moving forward with the Dead Sea Squirrels. Like, what else will we see? Are we working towards another season of Dead Sea Squirrels and continuing with the
Yeah.
books.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, I was so appreciative of you all at FPEA, for that opportunity on Family Night to
Oh, it was so
screen
much
the first
fun.
2 episodes. I was so excited, and just to that big of a crowd and the reception that it got. I kind of well up a little bit now thinking about it
Yeah.
just because it was such a special moment,
It
and
was.
so that was just wonderful to see that. And so that's launched now. I've signed a contract for 12 more books with
Okay.
Tyndale, another deal, and so I'm actually.
So we have something to look forward to.
Something to look forward to, yeah. So actually, I've written the first 2 of those 12 already.
Okay.
They're through copy editing. They're in illustration right now, so they'll be coming out. And we're beginning pre-production on season 2 of Squirrels now. So
See,
so
that's
we're hoping.
great.
We don't know exactly when that'll be out because animation just takes a long time.
It takes a
but we're hoping
while.
we'll make season 2 a lot faster than we made season 1.
That's great.
So,
That's great. So that's exciting and looking forward to that because I have to admit, going into it as a fan of VeggieTales, I was a little nervous. Like, am I going to love this? And I remember sitting there watching it and tearing up because my daughter, who I said, watched Where's God When I'm Scared? That was our first introduction, is sitting there with her 4 children watching this moment with me. And I'm just like, okay, I want to love it as much. And I did. I was sold at the end. Bought all the books for the kids. It was just like, this
my
is
goodness,
great.
Suzanne,
This is
that's
great.
wonderful.
So, but it is, and I love your creative work, and I love to see where things have grown and gone. Now, the podcast, you also had a podcast that is the Bible for Kids.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so that one is really fun. Dan Lynch, who I mentioned, who gave, wondered he's my literary agent and set up the deal for Squirrels. His vision was for there to be a resource for parents that in past days was sort of met by Christian bookstores, So, like you said, you'd love to go into Christian bookstores on a Saturday and look around and you talk about what's the latest thing, who's, what resources are available now. And as Christian bookstores have sort of kind of gone away, there's still some great stores out there, but they're nowhere near as many as there used to be.
Right.
What if there were kind of a podcast resource for parents who are looking to talk to authors with new projects out in, what used to get in a Christian bookstore, now maybe you could go to the Bible for Kids podcast and hear what's available. And so that was sort of the idea. And so Amy Parker and I began with that a number of years ago. And then Amy started law school and so didn't have time. And so she's a lawyer now. She's graduated. She's doing great. She's still writing, but she couldn't fit the podcast into her schedule anymore, understandably. And then Sarah Humphrey joined for a while as she's another author, kids author, and we had a wonderful time with her. And then now Tricia Goyer over the last couple months is now the new co-host. So it's just been wonderful to me to be involved with these other just wonderful authors as co-hosts, and just talking to other Christian authors who are in the kids space, providing resources for kids, and not just authors, but musicians and actors and whoever's involved in creating content with a biblical worldview are the types of folks that we have on our show. So it's really enjoyable.
Well, and I want to encourage anyone listening to listen to that, because I think one of the things about having that bookstore, that Christian bookstore that was in our neighborhood, was there was a certain element of trust. Like, you kind of build a trust for the products that they're going to present are going to be, okay. They're not going to come from somewhere in left field that we don't know anything about. And somebody has looked through this and decided, oh yeah, this content fits. And I think that now, if you're just a parent looking on Amazon or somewhere for something, you really don't know what you're going to land on. Having a good resource that says this is where you can get stuff that we can trust, we can have a good, strong biblical worldview. This is who, this is who this creator is, and bringing it to you is so important. It's really important. And so that was, for me several years ago, because my oldest, my youngest son is now in his early 20s, but we went to the homeschool conventions and looked there too, like for authors and people that, he could read faster than I ever thought about it, and would just devour books. And I was constantly looking for something
Yes.
And when I had the opportunity to be in a position where I could choose like some of the people who were going to be a part of that, I
Right.
was like, we need to bring in authors, like
Yeah.
people, so we can say to these people, these are people you can trust. Like,
Right.
here's good material and content for your kids
Yes.
that's not going to be scary,
Yes.
for you,
Yes.
what you're going to run into, and
Yeah.
more wholesome and clean than what you're going to find, in the world's element of this
Right.
type of genre or whatever it's
Yeah.
going to be.
Right.
That's really been important to me. So I love what you're doing with that because I think it's huge for parents to be able to trust that their
Yeah.
resources are strong and solid. And
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, thank you, Suzanne. And yeah, and again, with FPEA, what a great way to do that as well. And I've had, an opportunity to be there a few times and
yeah,
just, meet other authors and, the attendees. And it's just such a great community and really neat just to see what you all are doing. And one of the things I love about it is these
mm,
kids who grow up, in kind of the homeschool community and getting the opportunity to graduate and have their prom
oh
and all
yeah,
of that.
oh
It's just
absolutely.
such a cool thing.
Does it feel funny to be there though sometimes? Because I've seen this happen.
Uh-huh.
You're thinking, oh, the kids are going to want to go have their picture taken with
Uh-huh.
Larry the Cucumber's voice. But no,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the parents that are in there lined up. They're excited. That's so
Yes,
funny to me.
absolutely,
That's
absolutely.
fantastic. But well, I mean, we have had a great conversation, and I love every minute. I'm sure we could talk about so many other things, but I know that one of the things that we love about this podcast is we get to talk to people about the things that they did, the choices that they made, the risks that they took to
Yeah,
do something that was their passion and to follow even when they didn't know for sure how this was going to work out,
yeah,
and to
yeah,
pursue this. The story that you shared is fantastic in that way. And I find that when I'm talking to people a lot of the time, there is something that kind of set in their head, either when they were in that phase of taking their risks, a verse, something their parents said to them that just really resonated, or a famous quote that they heard and
yeah.
stuck that helped them navigate these processes and encourage them. Is there anything like that? Is there any quote or verse of scripture or anything that kind of just resonates with you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I talk about this all the time, and it's one of those things that kind of maybe wasn't necessarily with me from the early time, but it's sort of formulated after time, kind of looking
Mm-hmm.
back, saying, okay, this is kind of a verse that I can claim, and it's Proverbs 16:9, which is, we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps.
Oh yeah.
And
That's
and
a
I was always, a big plan maker. It's like, okay, I've got a plan to be, going to medicine, so
mm-hmm,
I'm
mm-hmm.
gonna do this, I'm gonna check off all these boxes. But along the way, I think as Christians, if we can be open to God using us, and I like to combine it with, I've done a talk where I sort of combine that with the message of Esther.
Yeah.
Maybe God can use you at such a time as this. But if we can, we can make our plans, but being open and willing to say, no, Lord, use me in a way that I could have never expected, at
Mm-hmm.
such a time as this to do the work that you want to do in the world. And so I think it's not just us saying, okay, I'm going to just wait here until I get those, specific instructions for God to go in this direction. It's like, you're kind of, I think God calls us in certain ways and then leads us on a path that maybe
Yeah.
we didn't expect. And so for me, that's the verse, that's the quote that, man can make his plans, but the Lord determines his steps.
Yeah. And I think that's so encouraging because, ultimately we don't have to know the end results. We just follow
Yeah. Yeah.
and are, faithful to keep moving. And,
Yeah.
I mean, just think if you had never moved to Chicago, if you'd gone ahead to California, where would we be?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
We
weird,
wouldn't.
you think of all these alternate things,
Yeah.
but yet, and I just, and I have conversations. I just got back from Japan, and hearing that, these kids who had grown up in Japan were VeggieTales fans, with a country that, has the gospel has a really hard time penetrating the culture there, but yet, VeggieTales was able to make a difference that, it was all news to me. It's like, wow, I had no idea. And just knowing that, God has used that in a way that was far above and beyond, my own work or my own power. And just that knowledge that when the word of God goes out there, it does not return void. And it's just been an amazing and incredible experience just to be part of his work in that way.
Well, I am so grateful that you were faithful to follow through and to continue to create, and your encouragement for others who are coming behind you in the next generation to continue to create and teach them, because I think, it's just so important. And I want to thank you again for being here today. Look forward to seeing you again soon, and maybe getting another chance to talk about some of this again, because it's very exciting work you're doing, and we love it. We love it.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you so much. And thank you again for the work that you do. And it's just an honor to be with you here today.
Thanks for listening to the Not by the Book podcast from the Florida Parent Educators Association. To learn more about homeschooling in Florida, or to find resources to help you on this amazing journey, visit our website at FPEA.com. If you have any suggestions for future guests, contact me, Suzanne, at notbythebook@fpea.com. Thanks again for listening, and be inspired to live your life not by the book.